Leave more for questions.
Right. Okay.
I'm just going to. Speaking from here, or
Why don't you?
Good afternoon. I'm Howard Walpe, Director of the Africa Program, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you and to welcome as well our distinguished panelists for today's program exploring the links between U.S. energy security and oil revenue transparency. I first want to indicate that today's program is being co-sponsored by Global Witness and by the Wilson Center, and we are pleased to have as honorary co-host of the program and in a kind of symbolic witness to the importance of the issue, growing importance of the issue on the Hill, Senators Russ Feingold and Dick Lugar. And in just a few moments we'll be hearing from a spokesman from one of Dick Lugar's people in his office, a professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I also, for those of you who may be new to the Wilson Center, just a brief word of introduction. The Wilson Center was established by an act of Congress back in 1968 as the living tribute to President Woodrow Wilson. The center was, President Wilson was the only American president to have a PhD, was a professor and a university president. And the Wilson Center was established to honor his commitment to bring together the worlds of ideas and the world of public policy. We are a neutral, nonpartisan institution devoted to debate, research, reflection on every conceivable global and national issue. Global Witness was established in 1993, leading the fight to break the links between the exploitation of natural resources and conflict and corruption. The results of their investigations and their lobbying have been a catalyst and a main driver behind many of the major international mechanisms and initiatives that have been established to address these issues, including the Kimberley Process and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI. So let me again welcome all of you. I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you all are, to I think it will be a very stimulating afternoon. I would now like to welcome up here to the dais for an opening introduction, Neil Brown, who serves as a special advisor to Senator Richard Lugar.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me just say thank you all for coming. I spent all morning with the Senator talking about these issues. We had various dignitaries in from Norway and Azerbaijan and a few Central American countries. And this was the topic of discussion, and he's very engaged on it and happy that this discussion is taking place. And I think it's taking place at a really crucial moment, a moment of risk and opportunity. And there are two things I think that make this moment unique and very charged. The first is that there's just been a fundamental change in global oil markets. Demand is surging. Supply is just barely keeping up. But the supply margin, the excess margin in oil is very, very thin. And what that means is that a terrorist attack, an insurgency in a place like Nigeria can have dramatic effects on the price of oil and on supplies, which of course have very dramatic effects on the politics in Washington. The third thing that's changing the global oil market is the politicization of supplies. You see a rising level of government control over production decisions, investment decisions, and the blatant use of supplies for political ends, if not all-out conflict. The effect of this is that we're seeing geopolitics change dramatically. You can do a tour of terror around the world. You see Russia and Venezuela really shifting the balance of power, asserting with their oil resources and the oil money unprecedented revenues where they don't have to cooperate as much as when they actually needed the financial incentives from the United States. You see our ability to enact sanctions, nuclear sanctions against the Iranian program, constrained by the fact that the world's dependent on their oil use or oil production. You see our humanitarian ideals slowed in a place like Sudan. China is the biggest investor in Sudan for its oil. The Sudanese government gets most of its financing from that oil. Yet we need China to help us with sanctions on the Security Council. And of course, I think probably close to a lot of the attention of the people here, our development agenda. An import-dependent country like Ethiopia, they spend more money, I believe, on oil imports than the entirety of our foreign assistance budget to the country. Dramatic amounts of money involved, and of course, a producing country like Nigeria, where the oil revenues can further entrench corruption, lead to conflict. You know that story well. The second thing that really makes this a crucial moment for discussion and action is the political attention. You see that everywhere on Capitol Hill, and that's very exciting. But I think what you see is that it's not just about gas prices anymore, and it's not just about domestic action. There's also a lot of attention to the national security problem, and that links very well to this transparency agenda. And I hope that we can find opportunities to link them. And so, as we've worked, the senators had many hearings on this topic and has various pieces of legislation that I won't bore you with. Although it's not boring, of course. You know, it's all very exciting. Don't tell them I said that. Uh-oh, we're on video. If any of it's boring, it's my fault. There are various opportunities to really make an opportunity of this unique moment instead of it having be just a risk of disaster. The first thing is to recognize the problem, to recognize the extent of the problem and how it touches on all these different environmental issues that are environmental development, et cetera, all these different issues that are sometimes disconnected. We're working on that in Congress, and I know organizations like the Wilson Center and having these events and Global Witness in the reports is incredibly valuable to it. The other thing that I think that is still missing that can play a big role is bringing together constituencies that maybe haven't worked so much together in the past. Development constituencies interested in transparency issues, they have real overlapping interests with domestic constituencies interested in changing our energy picture at home. If the U.S. is less dependent on oil, suddenly our hands are a bit freer to act in some of these oil-producing countries or not to act, to not support some of the regimes that we are dependent on for oil. A third thing that we can do is to strengthen institutions. We have to strengthen institutions at home. The Senator is working very hard with the Secretary of State to increase the capacity of the State Department to be proactive in the energy area, including transparency, and there's great progress recently. We're also working with multilateral development banks. We had some legislation passed last year that will, from the U.S. representation there, will increase transparency of their investments in the energy and other resources sector. And there are others as well, EITI, for example. And the other thing that we need to do is we need to build more international will. That's why this morning Senator Lugar joined with the development minister of Norway to launch a new Lugar-Solheim initiative to really promote the ideals that we believe in. We have a lot of parts working in the system. We have to bring them together. We have to have better communication. We have to really push the issue up much higher. And there's great opportunity for that. Shortly after, as I said, shortly after the announcement today with the Norwegian minister, we had the foreign minister of Azerbaijan there. And Azerbaijan, of course, has lots of problems, but it also says that it wants to abide the Norway model of using its oil revenues for development, for transparency, for putting forth an endowment, and it's even talking to its neighbors like Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan to make this happen in those countries too. And so I think we have great opportunities now. The question is, will we take them? And so I'm glad that we're here having the conversation, and the Senator sends his best. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks on behalf of Senator Lugar. I am very pleased with the diversity of the people that will be participating in today's program, representing government, industry, non-governmental perspectives on a very complex but significant set of issues. I am pleased now to introduce the moderator of our first panel, which will be focused on the relationship between energy security and an issue of revenue transparency. Ambassador Princeton Lyman, currently adjunct senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations, has held until recently the Ralph Bunche Chair for African Policy Studies at the Council. His career previously as a career Foreign Service officer included assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Ambassador for Nigeria, Director of Refugee Programs, Ambassador to South Africa. I think our lives have intersected at many different points in the past couple of decades. He's truly one of our most distinguished foreign service members of the Foreign Service, and also a distinguished Africanist. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Princeton Lyman, who will introduce our first set of panelists.
Hello, is this on? It is indeed. Thank you, Howard. Thanks very much. Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to the Woodrow Wilson International Center and Global Witness for this program today. As people have said up in the introductory remarks, it's an extremely timely subject. It has a bearing on our relationships with a wide number of countries, as well as the success of those countries in both political and economic areas. Our first panel is, as Howard indicated, wonderfully diverse, and I'm very pleased that we have representation from the IFIs, from the NGO world, and from the oil world. I'm going to introduce all three panelists first, and then I'm going to ask them to speak in that order. And each one will speak between 10 and 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussions. I might just say a quick word that when we talk about revenue transparency, that we need to take account, as the first page, I think, of that Global Witness paper says, we're talking about transparency in what's paid, what's earned, and what is spent. So we're talking about a transparency that cuts all the way across through the processes, and I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Our first speaker is going to be Charles McPherson, and many of you know he was for quite a few years the World Bank's person on energy and petroleum sector reform. He was involved in Angola, Argentina, Nigeria, Russian Federation, and elsewhere, very much involved in the World Bank's participation in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Before that, he spent a number of years working for international oil companies, so he brought that experience. And then most recently, he crossed the street and is now with the International Monetary Fund. 19th Street can be crossed. And he is an advisor in its fiscal affairs department with particular responsibilities for fiscal and financial policies in natural resource-rich countries. So we're delighted to have you here, Charles, and to have you lead off. Karen Lissiker is a wonderful expert in a number of fields, but she is particularly one of the true experts in the whole area of international finance. She is now director of the Revenue Watch Institute, and she is a senior advisor to George Soros on globalization issues. She served as executive director on the U.S. executive director on the board of the International Monetary Fund. She was there from 1993 to 2001, perhaps one of the more tumultuous periods in international finance with the Asia financial crisis, Mexico, and a few other major things. So she has an enormous amount of experience in that regard. She was also previously deputy director of the policy planning staff at the Department of State. She was director of the Foreign Economic Policy Subcommittee in the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. She has taught. She's an author of a book, Banks, Borrowers, and the Establishments. I love that title. And it's wonderful to have you with us, Karen. Our third speaker is Nick Welch. Anybody who has been around Washington, wants to know what's happening in the oil industry, knows Nick Welch. He is manager for international relations for Shell Oil, and he represents Shell's interests outside of the U.S., it must be outside of the UK, in Washington and around the country since 2002. He's been with Shell since 1996 in a variety of posts, and prior to that worked in the government of the United Kingdom. I also note that in his earlier life he worked for a multinational brewery company, which may have helped him out in coping with all these crises. I'm just delighted with the quality of this panel, and I would ask you, Charles, if you would begin. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lyman. It's a great pleasure to be here and be part of this panel. I've been asked to address the role of the IFIs in progress and challenges faced by them under the umbrella heading of our panel here in the first part of the afternoon, revenue transparency and its link to energy security. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I'd like to hear from my other fellow panelists and also from the audience, where I see very many knowledgeable faces out there, people who've been working on these issues for some time. The outline of my remarks: first, I'll set a little bit of the context for this discussion or debate, then identify some critical linkages or themes under the heading of the topic, summarize the expected benefits of transparency and the challenges of achieving transparency. And I'll close briefly with my assigned topic, which is the role of the IFIs in our progress to date in addressing these challenges. First of all, the context. The developing countries and the economies in transition hold 94% of the world's reserves and account for 88% of world exports of oil. The same numbers generally apply to natural gas and natural gas trade. Dependable access to these oil and gas supplies is critical to the energy and indeed the economic and security of major oil and gas importing countries, the U.S. foremost among them. The dependable access, in turn, is going to be inextricably linked with the stability of the exporting countries, and in particular in their ability to put themselves on paths towards sustainable development. Unfortunately, as most of you know, these goals have proved elusive, and many oil-rich developing countries have records of serious economic underperformance and have experienced significant social and political unrest and often very violent conflict. If you've seen some of the work done in that last area, you see that the presence of oil vastly increases the likelihood of violent conflict. A quick survey of global rankings of these countries does tell an ominous tale. More often than not, you find these countries clustered in the bottom third of rankings of countries by different categories. This is true for the World Bank's indicators of the quality of global governance. It's also true for Transparency International's corruption perceptions indices, the Fund for Peace Failed States Index, Freedom House's country rankings by Freedom of the Press, and so on. Quite simply, the sought-after stability and sustainable development have not materialized, and this has led to what's been widely known to this group as the resource curse or paradox of plenty. If you're going to successfully address this problem, and let me turn to some of these linkages, it's going to depend fundamentally on good governance. It'll depend on a number of technical factors and political factors, but the good governance part, the political part, is increasingly recognized as being central to solving the problem. Good governance will have several dimensions. It's going to include clear and stable laws, the application of the rule of law, high levels of capacity in government, something near and dear to the IMF is fiscal, monetary, and budgetary discipline, and an open dialogue between government and society. Civil society is well represented here, and that's a very critical part of the process. And low levels of corruption. But one of the cornerstones of good governance is certainly transparency. Like governance itself, transparency is going to have has a lot of dimensions, many dimensions. There's transparency of revenues, which I think is going to get a lot more attention here today from other panelists. Transparency of expenditure policies, laws and regulations, administration, operations, investments. You have to have this broad concept of transparency if you're really going to tackle the resource curse problem. All sectors could come under the transparency heading or require transparency, but it's especially important in the natural resource sector where the stakes are so incredibly high. What are the perceived benefits of transparency? Well, inclusion is one, bringing in stakeholders, fostering of democratic debate. Secondly, it certainly increases accountability and reduces the risk of waste and corruption. Third, it will enhance the access to finance. Any multilateral or commercial bank or investment banks or equity investors looking at a country are going to look to their record on governance and transparency before investing large sums. It improves macroeconomic management. To us, an extremely important aspect of it. You have to know where you've been and where you're going, what the numbers look like if you're going to manage your oil revenues effectively. And and contribute to economic development. All of these benefits expected of transparency should translate into greater stability and into sustainable development. But the challenges are huge. They're very large, and they're also very numerous, and at times they verge on intractable. At least it feels that way. Let me list a few of them. First, I would mention would be entrenched interests and corruption. And it should be apparent that the attraction of the oil sector to corruption is extraordinarily strong. Vested interests opposed to governance reforms, opposed to transparency, are going to be very powerful and very well financed. And rooting out corruption, installing transparency in these countries is going to be exceptionally difficult, even dangerous. I know that when we began talking about the EITI and putting the EITI in place in Nigeria, and we had a meeting with a number of stakeholders, and we talked about actually publishing the numbers on payments and so on, right down to the state level and local levels. One of the startled people in the small audience said, well, that's when I was going to start looking underneath my car when I go home. But it is a dangerous occupation. Sustained high-level, high-profile commitment is also extremely important to success. And this is not just commitment from the oil-rich exporting countries, but also from the developed countries. It's just as important. But it's sometimes problematic whether you're going to get this. Too often, the effectiveness of campaigns to introduce good governance, introduce transparency in developing countries, which are oil-rich, it has been undermined by a parallel dialogue which is sometimes confusing, which looks the other way when they see a failure of governance or corruption in an oil exporting country, out of concern on the oil importing countries for obtaining secure supplies. They don't want to jeopardize supply security by criticizing overly much the country that's supplying that oil. Then there's sovereignty issues, things like it's my oil, it's my policy, national patrimony, national heritage. These are phrases that are very often evoked by governments to make resistance, mask resistance to governance reform. Oil wealth itself, the previous speaker, Neil Brown, just alluded to this point I'm about to make, can be a challenge to reform. Rising oil prices, rising richness, why listen to anybody talking about reform? I don't need to, I've got the money to go my own way. Rogue aid, the first time I heard this phrase, somebody else may have come up with it, but the first time I saw it was in an article by Moses Naim in an editorial in the New York Times, where he was referring to the phenomenon where somebody can come in kind of under the radar screen, offer an oil-rich country aid as an alternative to getting aid from somebody else, and that somebody else might be one of our institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, who will tie the aid to governance reform, tie the aid to transparency. The rogue aid people, so-called, will come in and without any strings attached. And it makes it very difficult to implement good governance policies. Some of those countries that are regularly referred to, with or without cause, but are China, India, and South Korea, and so on, often referenced in this context. Institutional capacity is always a challenge. It's a challenge in every area, but it's typically very weak. I think it may be even weaker in countries which have oil wealth than elsewhere because it's not really needed. If you're going to address institutional capacity, you need to have technical assistance resources, and those are not always forthcoming. They're not always available at the level that they're required, and sometimes they're not particularly effective. Another challenge. Finally, sector-based reforms, like looking at an oil sector, trying to stabilize an oil sector, are going to stand a much better chance of succeeding if they are part of a broader countrywide program for promoting good governance and transparency. Referring back to Nigeria again, I think the reason the NEITI has been, or Nigeria program, has been so effective to date is that it was set in the context of a broad countrywide reforms introduced by President Obasanjo. It helped a great deal. Now let me close with some remarks on where we are in the IFIs on all of this. How have we responded? It may have seemed like a long time in coming, it may have seemed long overdue, but now both the IFIs, and the IFIs I'm going to refer to are just the ones I know well, which is the World Bank, the IFC, and now the IMF, have now unequivocally recognized the central or core importance of governance and transparency in these resource-rich countries. You have to get it right now. If we're going to turn them around, turn around the economies, turn around the societies, you have to pay attention to governance in these sectors. The Extractive Industries Review that I know a lot of you have heard about, a number of you, see one person right there, Ian Gary, actively participated in from the inside and the outside. It was run by the World Bank, was instructive in this regard. It was introduced by the World Bank to be a thoroughgoing review of all its policies and practices in the extractive industries sectors. And when the management response to the whole review came out, it was very clear there was going to be no turning back from assigning a very high priority to the analysis of governance in such countries and to their transparency. IFCs also introduced policies as a result of this, which are very favorable to transparency, even at the company level. These are internal these kinds of reviews really increased focusing the internal policies and programs for good governance, revenue management, and transparency in the resource-rich countries. The progress that was made there was closely watched at the IMF, which at the same time was sharpening its own focus on the root causes of poor performance and instability in these countries. Country assistance strategies, or CASs, if you know the inside language, board papers, of which this Extractive Industries Review was one, lending policies and the conditions attached to loans, Article 4 reviews that the IMF regularly conducts with its member countries, a review of their policies and so on, and the related reports on standards and codes which really focus on transparency issues and now especially focus on them in the oil sector areas under something called the Guide to Resource Revenue Transparency. If you haven't seen it, I have copies of it here. It can be accessed on the website. It shows just how serious and how wide-ranging reviews of governance and transparency have become in oil-rich countries. These all reflect the internal emphasis in the bank and the IMF. External policies and programs have also shared the same concerns, and very active support from the bank and the IMF, bank group and the IMF, to the EITI. Karen, I hope you're going to talk about the EITI, or somebody is in detail, but I assumed you would. And incidentally, I should say that there are a number of colleagues here from the bank and the IMF in the audience who can speak up during the discussion period to these issues. The bank administration and management of the EITI Multi-Donor Trust Fund has been an important external activity. It's now got some $12 million, John, I think, something like that, in committed funds for technical assistance to those countries who want to implement good transparency policies in their extractive sectors, with a number of donors, I think 6 donors and 3 more planned. And these engagements, these external kinds of engagements, formal arrangements, are complemented by a range of bilateral programs with Norway, with the UK, and so on, and by stakeholder dialogues with people like Nick here, with the industry, and with a lot of civil society audiences to address these topics in partnership. Let me close by saying then that, to my mind, over the past 5 or 6 years, the benefits and the power of transparency in introducing real reforms are widely appreciated now, and that many of the programs that were a response to this appreciation have got real traction now, growing traction. I think the risks to energy supply security are going to remain, but I think we can expect them to be reduced by this pursuit of transparency objectives. The IFI and their partners, and I stress the partnership part, which has been absolutely critical, have made significant progress over the half-dozen years. But as I mentioned, that list of challenges remains, and they're very, very difficult challenges. And I think during the rest of the program, at least certainly in the second panel, perhaps there's going to be some of the panelists will be addressing alternatives and options for tackling these challenges. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
And now Karen Liskers. Thanks.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak on a favorite subject, in fact, my life at the moment. I think my guess is that most people in this room are quite familiar with the central features and tenets of the resource curse phenomenon, and if you are not, there's excellent report that the Global Witness has just produced and published, released just today, I believe, or this week, really lays out, I think, in very clear and concise terms, the issues that confront U.S. policy in this area and the link between transparency, governance, and U.S. energy security. And since we're here in Washington in the center of the policy community, I want to focus on this from the perspective of U.S. National interest. One striking feature of the so-called resource curse is that some of the wealthiest countries in terms of natural resources are also among the world's poorest in terms of the quality of life, the living standard for the majority of people living in those very resource wealthy countries. And a lot of effort and now increasing, a lot of thought and now increasingly effort by many governments and companies are coalescing to try to address this in a way that is not just in the most immediately and obviously to the benefit of the citizens in the producing countries, but also has direct spillover benefits for the consuming countries like the United States, which are so dependent on imported oil, gas, and other vital minerals. There is a very clear line of causality between corruption and conflict, which can be rent seekers fighting over the spoils, corruption, poverty, and conflict when the citizens revolt over being cheated out of their own resources, corruption, poverty, conflict, and supply disruption. And there's, of course, the most clear example of the situation in the Niger Delta and the disruptions of Shell's operations there, repeated shutdowns, kidnappings, smuggling, tapping into pipelines, and just large dysfunction, partly by various rebel groups and partly undoubtedly in collusion with certain factions of the power structure, whether the military or other figures of influence. It costs us directly as consumers. It costs the people who live in the Niger Delta the most, but it also costs us in terms of what we pay at the pump and uncertainty and the volatility in the oil market. So if you want to be crass about it, that's a way to look at our direct self-interest. And if you look at the situation in Zimbabwe, where certainly commodities are more mining, are part of the mix of the conflict. But if you look at, just take two countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Zimbabwe, and you see how quickly and how dramatically sort of low-level conflict of the kind we see in the Niger Delta can suddenly explode and just rip a country to pieces and lead to a protracted, decades-long or more conflict and civil war. I mean, Angola is a case in point. So if you think there are problems now in the Niger Delta, they're actually quite modest compared to the potential for a much more wide-scale conflict. I don't think that that's where Nigeria is headed, partly because there has been a really strong reform move under the government in the last few years, and I think we haven't seen the payoff from that yet. But I think and I hope that we will if the government that succeeds the Obasanjo government carries forward the reforms, and I'll come back to that. But I would say, so we focus on conflict and the impact on us as consumers. I think this is another effect of lack of transparency, which not as much thought has gone into and attention. That is that lack of transparency hurts the state oil companies. And I think many of you are aware of the fact that the largest oil and gas reserves are not controlled by the Shells and the Exxons and the BPs anymore. They're under the control of state oil companies. And you can point to case after case after case where the lack of transparency about the financial relationship between the state company as an operating company and the state as a user of the resources that the state oil company generate. It actually damages the operations of the company. It limits the ability of a state company like Pertamina or Pemex or Petronas to set aside enough investment capital to operate at an efficient level and to maximize the development of the resources they have under their direct control. So again, if you look at it in crass self-interest, we want the state oil companies to operate really well, and increasing the transparency of their operations, which is a subset of the larger transparency challenge, is very, very important. And I think, frankly, that the leadership in some state oil companies recognize this and are allies, at least quietly, where some other parts of the government may not be allies for obvious reasons, in the fight for transparency. And I think we need to focus a little more on that aspect and think a little more creatively about how we can help to move on that front. In terms of public policy, I think it's very obvious that from U.S. foreign policy, we can't have it both ways. There is no credibility for our policy stance if we preach good governance and transparency in developing countries, in some developing countries, and look the other way at states like Equatorial Guinea, for example, because they happen to be important suppliers of oil. You can't have it both ways, and it is extremely short-sighted to think you can. It's not just bad from credibility standpoint. It is bad even from a long-term energy security standpoint. And you see the wave of natural resource nationalism and populism now that is sweeping many countries that Charles McPherson referred to. And you need to think about the citizens who live in the countries that have the resources that we depend on. China has a very straightforward policy. It's a publicly stated policy that they don't care about governance. They will invest to get the resources, and they are not going to, quote, interfere in the internal policies. I think over the long run that will turn around to bite them. Well, that's their problem, but from our standpoint, copying them is not the way to go. Trying to bring China to the table and make them part of the international push to develop a global standard of transparency and governance over these sectors is the way to go. And I think it is possible with a concerted push from the G8 to bring them into the dialogue and bring them to the table. It's not just a matter, of course, of the consuming countries. You already see, in fact, a lot of movement on the part of producing countries, like Nigeria. Charles referred to NEITI. There is an international initiative called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative that was launched by Tony Blair in 2002. It is an interesting phenomenon because it's a voluntary initiative, but it has begun to gain momentum and adherence, partly because a couple of countries, quite unexpected, I would say, certainly by the NGO community, decided to, for various reasons, to be the leaders and the pilots for this initiative, and that was Nigeria and Azerbaijan. Indeed, Nigeria went beyond the NITI design by also doing audits and adding a lot of information to the public domain that wasn't there before. Azerbaijan has been one of the first to also begin to implement EITI. And it's a simple initiative. All the companies, and I say all the companies, including the state companies that are operating in a country, are required to report their payments to the state. And the state, in return, publishes its receipts from the extractive industries. There's a mining reporting template and there's an oil and gas reporting template. And it's quite comprehensive. It covers signature bonuses, royalties, payments in kind, profit oil, and so on. And one of the benefits of this is that it has indeed highlighted the weaknesses of management and accounting and accountability in some of the state companies. In Nigeria, the information hasn't trickled down yet to the ground, to the communities where public services are delivered, but I think it's coming. Because the finance minister took the initiative of publishing monthly all the distribution of oil revenues, which is the main source of Nigeria's government revenue, from the central government to all the individual states and from the states to the municipalities. And once that number shows up at the municipal level, it is possible for citizens to start asking the local officials questions about, why do you tell me you don't have you don't have money for schools or teachers or textbooks or health clinics when I see in the newspaper that you are getting this much from Abuja? Transparency is the key to citizen empowerment. That's why we focus on revenue transparency. If the citizens know how much money is coming in to public coffers, they can start to ask questions about where it's going and how it's being spent. And that is really the key to fixing the resource curves. Now, EITI, as I said, is interesting, because it's voluntary, but a key aspect of it, which has huge values, is that it is a multi-stakeholder process, both at the international level, because there's an international governance structure, and at the national level. Every country that decides it's going to implement EITI has to create a committee, an oversight implementation committee at the national level, which includes government representatives, company representatives, and civil society representatives. Now, we are dealing with a lot of autocratic states here, where citizens have very few chances to speak, much less sit at the table with senior government officials, companies, representatives. EITI has created an umbrella where that is possible, indeed where it's happening. This has created, I think, both better relations between citizens groups and the government, but also created a somewhat friendlier environment for companies. I think the companies many of them have decided that this transparency initiative is good for business. And Shell, for example, has been quite involved. BP, Chevron have been very constructive in this. But EITI still only covers a relatively small set of countries. I think there are a number of things the U.S. government should be doing. It should back EITI, which it has been doing. Steve Krasner, who will be speaking later, has been very proactive and participated in the EITI governing board. But among the major industrial countries, the U.S. gives a pittance to support the initiative and to make it possible to promote and help countries implement the EITI. We give $1 million. Other countries are giving tens of millions of dollars, and I think it's up to Congress to allocate some more money for EITI support. I mean, Norway has a $50 million oil for development fund, and they do a lot of other work in this area by itself. And it is an oil-rich, but it is a very small country. In the U.S., it's shamefully stingy on this front. But more than that, I think we should start practicing what we preach. And we should do that in a number of ways. One, we should pass legislation that makes it a law in the U.S. that companies publish what they pay to individual governments. We should encourage the International Accounting Standards Board to adopt an accounting rule that makes all these payments transparent. That would level the playing field. It would encourage, Europe is considering something like this. I think it would be, if we did it, if we led by example, as we did with the FCPA, we would get other major countries that are capital market basis to do the same. I think the IFIs have to increase their transparency of their own investment activities in the extractive industries. I think the U.S. needs to practice what it preaches at home. We have a scandal in the way the Interior Department manages our national mineral resources on federal and Indian lands, and we need a transparency initiative on that front to show that we are not just talking about poor developing countries. Should be a global standard of proper transparency and management. And finally, we need to protect civil society. We have just had the drama of Sarah Wykes of Global Witness, who was arrested and held for almost a month in Angola on spurious espionage charges. The charges are still pending. She has been allowed to leave. But that is not protection. And there are other local citizens in Congo, Brazzaville, and elsewhere who have also been charged spuriously because they dare to question how the state is managing oil and gas resources. And it takes a concerted international effort by everybody to make sure that this kind of harassment doesn't happen. Because the only cure for the resource curse in the end is the empowerment of the citizens to ask and demand accountability from their authorities over the management of these resources. Thank you.
And now Nick Balch. Please.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give a bit of a company perspective for this issue. And I think it's important that companies are represented. We certainly recognise that because of our operations, because of what we do, we have to be part of this debate. I know lots of you wouldn't let us escape from that responsibility even if we wanted to, but we certainly don't. We know that it's something that's very important. And not least, quite a lot's been said about Nigeria this afternoon already. And I can tell you for all my colleagues who are working there and grappling with this issue, we know very well that insofar as that is about transparency and governance, and it's about a lot of things, but insofar as it's to do with that, we recognise clearly the role that this subject matter has. Let me start by saying I found myself in violent agreement with a fair bit of the analysis that was given already, so I will try to keep my remarks short so there's plenty of time for questions and discussion, and try to pull out a couple of industry-specific or company-specific slants and perspectives to open things up a little bit. But I should say at the outset that we've been a strong supporter from the very beginning of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Karen was saying we're active on the ground in Nigeria as well as internationally, and you know there are good reasons for that. It isn't an answer to the whole picture. This report came out today. I haven't missed it. I didn't fail to read this before. It was out just today. Yeah, right, good, because I thought I was remiss in not having digested it beforehand. But I think, and as Charles said earlier on, you know, there's three bits to this. There's publishing what you pay, or sort of alluding to the report, publishing what you earn, and publishing what you spend. And the EITI itself, as a voluntary piece, is only really covering the pay side. And as Karen was saying, if we look at Nigeria, that it's gone sort of downstream a little bit in terms of publishing, the revenues going out to the states as well, and that's important. But you know, why do we see this as important? It's self-evident from all the evidence that was alluded to earlier that these revenues can be very substantial, particularly in relation to the size of economies overall, and if used poorly, they can have bad effects, and where they can be used well, they can have a good effect on development. Now, let me be crass and just look at it from our point of view as opposed to the welfare of those societies. When there is destabilisation, that not only is costly financially for organisations like our own, but it's costly. It can be costly in terms of lives, certainly safety and security and well-being. So we see a very clear reason why we should support not just the EITI, but other initiatives that perhaps go beyond our own direct sphere and even greater sphere of indirect sphere of influence that can help these things go. It's in our own interest as well as those of the citizens of these societies. So that makes it a better environment for us, and it's self-evident that that's good for that. But then the question is, to what extent is transparency closely linked to the issue of energy security? I would very much echo, clearly transparency is a key cornerstone of good governance, but I like the way Charles put it. This is really about, it's not just about revenue transparency, it's really about good governance in these societies. So I understand in the current debate around energy security why there's a case for linkage, but I think it's important from an energy company point of view to set the sort of energy security scene a little bit more broadly. I mean, you can define energy security in a variety of ways, but if you're talking about diversity of types of energy and diversity of sources, affordability, and many of us, I think, would include the issue of impact on social and environmental impacts. At an environmental level, most recently, I think people think about the whole climate change issue. Socially, those things can be more local and perhaps germane to what we're talking about today. So it clearly is important in terms of stabilisation, but it's not, from an energy company point of view, the only show in town. And I think it's worth stressing that, because for us, paradoxically, and I think actually for anybody interested in energy security for the world as a whole, not necessarily a given country, funnily enough, it's access and the ability to make timely investments, which is one of the things that's it's very, very much top of the list of things that matter. And you can see that the extent to which instability and some of the resource nationalism can have an effect both on access and timely investments. Charles alluded to gas as well. This is very much about gas as much as it is about oil, and that's particularly the case. We'll talk about the role of competing countries for supplies. But whereas oil can flow all over the place, increasingly you see that if it's companies like Exxon or BP or Chevron or ourselves setting up a project, then although there's a certain degree of flexibility in gas for where that's going, you've often got long-term contracts making those gas flows go in a particular direction. Equally, when you have some of the newer players on the scene securing access and investing in projects in countries, then they are also tying up often gas flows for very long periods of time in arguably often a different direction. So it's important how this plays out between the role that Western companies that are part of this debate currently and the role of a lot of the companies and countries that are not necessarily part of this debate right now, how that plays out, because there are decisions going to be made on investments which will be very long term and have a big impact on energy security. I understand that this afternoon's discussion and the report is specifically US focused, but in fact we're very much in an interdependent world, and even if we were able to succeed in improving the governance of countries that are specifically supplying oil to the US, that doesn't actually solve things, because prices for oil certainly is essentially a global market. I mentioned gas, that's more regional, but it isn't just about tidying up places that one country's getting resources from. It's much more of a global issue. We have an interest. Transparency is important for us in other respects as well, again thinking about our access, and the world has this from an energy security point of view as well, because we want more transparency of data around reserves and holdings. So we get the point about the transparency thing more broadly as well, and it's something which the International Energy Agency and others talk about a lot. But clearly within this, transparency of oil revenue flows, indeed gas flows as well, is an important part of this. It clearly has risen on the international agenda, and rightly so. And it clearly does have a linkage to the issue of energy security. There are a couple of paradoxes that I think it's worth throwing up as well. Karen was saying that the good efforts that have been made in Nigeria, those haven't paid off yet, and hopefully they will do. Again, just looking at it in a short-term perspective for energy security, I think when people do get hold of the information they should have, there is a possibility of disruption in the short term to what's going on. That's a price from an energy security point of view we ought to recognise that we might need to pay for the longer term benefit of greater stability. And I wouldn't argue for a moment that what's currently going on in the Delta is a result of the Nigerian Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative at all. But you can imagine, where you alluded to the issue of people looking under their cars, and once this information starts coming out, you can see that it can be disruptive. But that's not a reason to argue against it. But if you're linking this to energy security, you have to think about some of the short-term impacts as well. Particularly in times of high oil prices and high demand, this is a difficult time, I think, to take this agenda forward. Again, not a reason not to try. I note again, I mean, the report is written from a US policymaker's perspective, and I took a quick glance at the recommendations, as one always does. Right, what are we expected to do in here? And there's a good list of things for the US government. It's not for me to comment on all of those. Some for the IMF and the World Bank, some for companies, and one or maybe more for the UN. But of course, the big problem of this is what is the incentive for those folks that are controlling resources, that are running countries? What are the incentives for them to open up and change the way they operate? Clearly, some people are doing that, so there are incentives that can be there. But it is a difficult, it's an imponderable issue, and let's not deny the fact that it's, if this were easy, we wouldn't be here now. And this is compounded, as I say, in periods of high prices where our leverage is reduced. Perhaps all the more reason to think about the extra things that need to be done. High prices, but also high demand. We've heard a little bit already about the role of some of the new Asian players. And again, another paradox there is we're all in strong competition for access to these resources. It is a difficult time for Western companies to really put a lot of pressure on around some of these issues when, what did you call it, rogue aid? That was the phrase, when that type of thing is in play as well. Now, it's not an excuse for not trying to take forward the agenda again, but we have to recognise that trying to bring in other consuming countries in the world is really pretty important for this. And you see it a little bit. I think there's some signs in relation to Sudan, as I see it, that the Chinese might be interested in doing something there down the road, from what I hear from Andrew Natsios. Who knows? I don't follow that closely enough. But what we need to do is to find measures which will, and incentives. You have to incentivise people somehow or another to make them see that this is a good thing to do. So it's a road that has some difficulties, particularly at the moment in terms of high demand and
Nick,
high.
I'll have to get Phil finish up.
Okay, that's fine. So I came without watch. It's a difficult road, but particularly at the moment, but clearly something worth pursuing.
I had no idea I had that power. We have a few minutes for questions, if that's okay, Howard. We're running a little bit late. But let me take 3 or 4 questions, and if you both identify yourself when you stand up. Do we have people with microphones? Do we? We do. And identify yourself, and if you're directing a question to an individual on the panel, please say so, and I'll ask you to sort of jot down, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions in a row. Who has questions, comment? Ian, you want to come here to Ian Gary?
And this is for the panel in general, if whoever wants to comment on it. The question of lack of transparency and corruption in bidding processes, and then lack of disclosure of contracts, I think is an important issue that ties into this discussion that we're having. Looking at, for example, Bolivia, where a lot of the contracts were signed in secret, were later disclosed, and I think that led to, in part, the instability in Bolivia, for example. Now in Bolivia, you have a new hydrocarbons law, which requires that the National Assembly or the Parliament approve of all contracts. So I'm wondering if anybody would care to comment on the importance of transparency in the bidding process and of the contracts.
Other questions? Yes, Jeff, microphone right here.
I'm Jeff Burnham in the State Department, but for many years I was with Senator Lugar, so I'm well aware of the foreign policy aspects of and his own views. I would just like to stress the fact that we need to very vigorously develop alternative sources of energy, not only for the United States, but also for Africa and the developing countries, because citizens, and even in Nigeria, can't really afford to pay the kind of gasoline prices that you would have if you charged the market price. And all over Africa, there are many countries without their own sources of oil and gas. And the fundamental reality from a foreign policy point of view, I guess this is a comment, I'm sorry, it is that until you have alternatives to oil and gas, the U.S. and everybody else is going to be dependent upon these developing countries for the energy supplies. And as Nick points out, fundamentally that's going to reduce our leverage to do the sorts of things that Global Witness and everybody else would like to see in terms of the corruption. So I think that is a fundamental reality that Senator Lugar is addressing in other contexts, and the people on the Hill are as well, and as part of our Africa energy strategy in the State Department.
Thanks. Other questions? The lady right here, and then I'll come over to Hank. The lady right in the middle. Here we go. Thanks very much.
Hi, my name is Lori Regelbrugge, and I'm with PACT. And two quick questions. One is the leverage question, and what new options are we exploring in sort of leveraging the conversation differently, recognizing that we don't have the same leverage through IFIs and through just diplomatic relations and economic relations that we once had. The second question is that the work of transparency is much more involved than the principle of it, which came out strongly in a recent Oxfam America report. And so, again, what do you feel are the roles of your various institutions in helping to build the capability to really do the work on the ground that transparency requires? Thanks.
Thank you. Hank Cohen?
I'm Hank Cohen of SAIS Johns Hopkins. Again, on the leverage issue, in my travels around Africa, I note that some of the oil producers are not content with current revenue. They tend to go into financial markets and borrow against future oil revenue. I know Angola is one of the biggest perpetrators of that. We have a lot of leverage against Iran and North Korea in the financial markets. Couldn't we do this against designated non-transparency countries and that sort of thing? Just an idea.
Interesting. I'll take one more question from Paul here, and then I'll come back on the second round if I can. Or I'll take one more there too, and then we'll wrap it up. Paul, and then the gentleman way back there in the middle.
Thank you. It might be
Paul Hare.
Paul Hare might be touching on the same subject as Hank's, but recently, on two occasions, I've heard the importance attached to the banking system as one way to put leverage and pressure. Robin West mentioned this at a colloquium. Nick was there. That this is the way. Perhaps it's not as an incentive, but a disincentive.
Yeah.
And I was just reading an article by Paul Collier, which Charles actually sent me, in which he stressed the importance of this same issue. And somehow I don't have a feeling that this issue has really been fleshed out or in a very serious way, but perhaps it has, but I appreciate any comment on it.
And we'll take one more question. This gentleman way in the back in the middle with his hand up. And then I think I'll ask the reverse order. We'll take it.
My name is Shola Omole. I'm with Chevron, and I'm also a Nigerian. I'm happy with the comments and the sentiments that have been expressed relative to the progress that's been made in terms of publishing what the government of Nigeria receives and what's published on a monthly basis, and stuff goes to the states. My issue is how that then translates into the expectation of the citizenry being able to then challenge government and government functionaries as to how that is spent, because that's the ultimate objective, is to ensure that money is well spent, provides good governance and improved quality of life for the people at the end of the day. How do you get to that next level? It's okay to make the governments publish what they get, but how do you educate the citizenry to really understand that they do have the authority to be able to question governments? Because experience says that many, many years ago, folks had difficulty just speaking up at all. Is there a role for anybody in terms of educating the people?
An interesting question on the eve of the Nigerian elections. I'm going to ask the panel in reverse order to pick up on these questions and comments. We'll have to go fairly quickly, but I'll start with Nick.
Okay, alternatives, they're going to take a lot longer to get to, and these problems are still going to be around. So good, but we need to deal with this issue in the meantime. There is a greater role, and I think certainly for our type of institution, there's more that we could be doing in capacity building on the ground, picks up on Laurie's point as well around helping foster scrutiny and so on. So we could probably be doing more. It's probably better that we do that with civil society than companies building capacity in government institutions, which I think is more Charles's area.
You want to say something about bidding and contracts?
Oh, bidding, yeah. Well, that can certainly help. I mean, what's important is faith in the process. I mean, governments can choose different ways of letting contracts. If the only way of ensuring faith and belief in the system is through